Tonight, the investigation into the abduction of Nancy Guthrie intensifying as authorities focus on DNA found on a glove that was discovered about 2 miles from Miss Guthrie's home there in Arizona.
They took an 84-year-old woman right out of her own home. Her daughter watches millions of people every single morning on live television, and she still has no idea where her mother is. But investigators have just uncovered something inside that house that nobody was prepared for. A DNA sample. Unidentified, unexplained. And it does not match a single person who had any business being there.
It's been 2 weeks since our mom was taken. We still have hope. And I wanted to say to whoever has her or knows where she is that it's never too late.
What this discovery reveals next could blow this entire case wide open. You are not going to believe where this investigation is heading. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on February the 1st, 2026, from her home in Tucson, Arizona. What began as a missing persons report quickly escalated when law enforcement arrived on the scene and found evidence suggesting something far more serious had taken place. Blood was found at the property, and it became clear early on that this was not a straightforward case of an elderly woman wandering off or going somewhere without telling anyone. Investigators treated the scene as a crime scene from the very beginning, and the case has only grown more complicated in the weeks since. Since Nancy disappeared, the FBI has received close to 20,000 tips from the public. When you combine that figure with the tips received by the Pima County Sheriff's Office, the total number sits at roughly 50,000. According to the sheriff himself in a recent interview with NBC News, that is an enormous amount of information for investigators to work through, and it gives you some sense of just how much public attention this case has attracted. The involvement of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces on American morning television, has understandably brought a level of national attention that most missing person cases simply do not receive. With that attention comes pressure, and with pressure comes scrutiny of every move law enforcement makes. One of the most significant developments in recent days was a raid carried out on the evening of February the 13th, 2026. Law enforcement executed 2 federally approved search warrants. The first was carried out during a traffic stop near a Culver's restaurant in Tucson, where a man was pulled over while driving a Range Rover. The second search warrant was executed at a residential property where the same man lives with his 77-year-old mother. The property is reportedly worth around $1 million and sits in a well-off neighborhood approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. A SWAT team was involved in the execution of that second search warrant. Both the man and his mother were detained while officers conducted their search. He was not arrested. He was questioned and then released. An Arizona law firm has since come forward to identify their client as Luke Daly, a 37-year-old man. The firm released a statement to 12 News in Phoenix, confirming that Daly was the subject of both search warrants served on February the 13th. The statement was clear and direct. According to the law firm, Luke, Daly has no connection whatsoever to Nancy Guthrie and has no information related to her disappearance. The statement also said that both Daly and his mother hope that Nancy will be found and returned to her family unharmed. On the surface, that might sound like the end of the story for Luke Daly. He was detained, he was released, and his attorney says he has nothing to do with any of this. But the Pima County Sheriff, Chris Nanos, has not closed the door on Daly's potential involvement. In a one-on-one interview with 12 News, Nanos was asked directly whether Daly had been cleared as a suspect. The sheriff's response was careful and measured. He explained that under the terms of the court order, law enforcement was required to search those properties and that anyone inside the home at the time of the search had to be outside while officers did their work. He acknowledged that Daly, whom he referred to openly as a person of interest, had cooperated with investigators. Daly provided a statement and complied with whatever the warrant required, whether that was a DNA swab, photographs, or fingerprints. Nanos confirmed that law enforcement got what they needed and that Daly was then free to go. But then the sheriff said something worth paying close attention to. He noted that releasing someone after executing a search warrant does not automatically mean that person is no longer a suspect. He pointed out that there is still evidence from the search that needs to be processed. And then he asked a question that frames exactly where this investigation stands right now. What if Nancy Guthrie's DNA turns up inside that home? It is not yet known whether any DNA belonging to Nancy was found at Luke Daly's property. Law enforcement has not confirmed that, and his legal team has firmly denied any link between their client and the case. But the fact that the sheriff raised that scenario publicly in a sit-down interview tells you something about how investigators are still viewing this person, regardless of what his attorney says. Away from the Daly situation, there are other threads of the investigation worth noting. Law enforcement has reportedly been visiting gun stores in the Tucson area in recent days. According to reports, officers have been showing up with a list of names and photographs, asking store owners and staff whether any of the people on that list are familiar to them as customers from the past year. This kind of legwork, going business to business with a list of names and pictures, suggests that investigators are trying to build a picture of who certain individuals are and what they may have been doing in the period leading up to Nancy's disappearance. It is methodical, unglamorous police work, but it is the sort of thing that can quietly produce results. Then there is the matter of the DNA sample found inside Nancy Guthrie's home. This is arguably one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. The sample does not belong to Nancy. It does not belong to any member of her family, and it does not belong to anyone close to her. When the sample was run through CODIS, which is the FBI's national database of DNA profiles collected from people who have previously been arrested or convicted of crimes, there was no match. That might sound like a dead end, but it is important to understand what CODIS actually is and what its limitations are. The database only contains DNA profiles from individuals who have had some prior contact with the criminal justice system. Estimates suggest that CODIS covers somewhere between 4 and 6% of the total population. That means the vast majority of people in the United States are simply not in that database. If the person who left that DNA sample inside Nancy Guthrie's home has never been arrested or convicted of anything in the United States, they would not show up there. A lack of a match in CODIS does not mean the DNA is useless. Far from it. Investigators are now turning to a different approach, one that has produced results in some notable cases in recent years. The Pima County Sheriff has confirmed that his team is working with what is known as genetic genealogy. Rather than looking for a direct match of a DNA profile in a criminal database, genetic genealogy takes a DNA sample and tries to identify the person by examining their ancestry. Investigators look for shared DNA markers between the unknown sample and profiles in genealogy databases, the kind of databases that ordinary people use to trace their family histories and find distant relatives. By identifying those distant connections, whether they are third cousins or fourth cousins, investigators can start building out a family tree and, through a process of narrowing down and eliminating candidates, eventually work their way toward identifying the individual whose DNA they have. This approach has already proven its value in real-world cases, and it is now being applied to one of the most high-profile missing person investigations the United States has seen in years. Whether it produces a result quickly enough to make a difference in finding Nancy Guthrie remains to be seen. But for the families, the investigators, and the many people following this case closely, it represents one of the most promising avenues currently available. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has also stated publicly that he believes the person seen on the front steps of Nancy Guthrie's home, a masked individual captured on camera and armed with a gun, may not have been working alone. Investigators have not ruled out the possibility that there was more than one person involved. The sheriff has described his belief that the crime was targeted, meaning that whoever carried this out knew who Nancy Guthrie was and specifically chose to go after her. He called that a hunch in one interview, but it is the kind of hunch that comes from someone who has been looking at the available evidence as closely. Whether that ultimately proves to be correct is something only time and the ongoing investigation will reveal. One of the most closely watched aspects of the Nancy Guthrie investigation right now is the use of a technique that sits at the intersection of modern science and traditional detective work. Genetic genealogy has been quietly transforming the way law enforcement approaches cold cases and difficult investigations for a number of years. And it is now being applied to one of the most prominent missing person cases in recent American history. To understand why investigators are placing such significance on this approach, it helps to first understand what it actually involves, how it works in practice, and what it has already achieved in cases that once seemed impossible to solve. When a DNA sample is collected at a crime scene and it does not match anyone already in a criminal database, investigators have historically found themselves at a wall. The sample exists, the science is there, but without a name to attach to it, it can sit in an evidence file for years, sometimes decades, without leading anywhere. Genetic genealogy was developed as a way of getting around that wall. Instead of relying on criminal databases, which only contain profiles from people who have previously been arrested or convicted, investigators using genetic genealogy turned to a completely different kind of database, the kind that ordinary members of the public use to explore their own ancestry and find long-lost relatives. Companies and platforms like GED Match allow people to upload their DNA results and compare them against other users in the database to find shared ancestry. When an investigator uploads an unknown DNA sample from a crime scene, they are not necessarily looking for a direct match. What they are looking for is a partial match, the kind of genetic overlap you would see between distant relatives such as third or fourth cousins. From there, analysts begin the painstaking work of building out family trees, tracing lines of descent, cross-referencing public records, birth certificates, census data, obituaries, and any other available information to narrow down the possible candidates. Eventually, if the process works as intended, you arrive at a short list of individuals who could plausibly be the source of that DNA. From that shortlist, law enforcement can take steps to collect a sample from a specific person and confirm whether they have found their match. It sounds methodical because it is. It is not fast and it is not simple. But the results it has produced in real cases speak for themselves. One of the clearest examples of genetic genealogy delivering justice in a case where traditional methods had failed is the investigation into the murder of Rachel Morin. Morin was a 37-year-old mother of 5 children living in Maryland. In August of 2023, she went out for a jog along a trail near her home, something she did regularly. She never came back. Her body was later found, and the circumstances of her death made it immediately clear that she had been the victim of a violent attack. She had been raped and murdered. Law enforcement collected DNA from the scene. When that sample was run through CODIS, the FBI's national criminal database, there was no match. Whoever had done this had no prior criminal record in the United States, which meant the standard route of identification was not available. Investigators turned to genetic genealogy. Through the process of identifying distant relatives in ancestry databases and carefully building out family trees, analysts were able to work their way toward a suspect. The man they eventually identified was Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez. Martinez Hernandez was not an American citizen. He had entered the United States illegally, having fled his home country of El Salvador after a warrant was issued there for his arrest in connection with a murder. He had no criminal record in the United States, which is precisely why he did not appear in CODIS. But his DNA and the DNA of relatives who had used ancestry platforms created a trail that investigators were able to follow. 10 months after Rachel Morin was killed, law enforcement tracked Martinez Hernandez down outside a bar in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. He is now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The case is a sobering reminder of 2 things. First, that the absence of a match in a criminal database is not the end of an investigation. Second, that genetic genealogy can work even when a suspect has no prior criminal history in the country where the crime took place. Those 2 points are directly relevant to what is happening in Tucson right now. The other case that has come to define public awareness of genetic genealogy is one that unfolded in California and captured the attention of the entire country. It is the case of the Golden State Killer, a name given to a man responsible for a prolonged and deeply disturbing series of crimes that took place across California during the 1970s and 1980s. Over the course of roughly a decade, this individual committed dozens of sexual assaults and was responsible for more than a dozen murders. Despite extensive investigations, he was never identified during the period when the crimes were being committed. The case went cold. Victims and their families lived for years, in some cases decades, without any answers. Law enforcement did, however, hold on to DNA samples collected from crime scenes during those years. When CODIS was established and expanded, those samples were entered into the database. No match came back. The crimes remained unsolved, and for a long time it seemed entirely possible that the perpetrator might die without ever being held accountable. Then genetic genealogy entered the picture. Investigators compared the DNA from the Golden State Killer crime scenes against profiles in GDmatch, the public ancestry platform. There was no direct match, but there were partial matches, the kind that indicate shared ancestry between the unknown individual and some of the people in the database. Analysts began the laborious process of constructing family trees from those distant connections, tracing branches, eliminating candidates, and slowly narrowing the field. The work led them to a man named Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was a former police officer, which added a particularly unsettling dimension to the case. He had served in law enforcement himself during the years when many of the crimes were committed. He was living quietly in the Sacramento area when investigators closed in on him. A DNA sample collected covertly from something DeAngelo had discarded in public confirmed that he was the man whose DNA matched the samples from the crime scenes. He was arrested in April of 2018, more than 4 decades after the first of his known crimes. At the time of his arrest, DeAngelo was 72 years old. He later pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and other charges. Because of statutes of limitations that applied in California, he could not be prosecuted for the sexual assaults, despite the fact that investigators believe he committed dozens of them. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and remains incarcerated today. The Golden State Killer case is significant not just because of the outcome, but because of what it demonstrated to law enforcement agencies across the country. It showed that genetic genealogy could solve cases that had been sitting cold for 40 years. It showed that even when a suspect had managed to evade justice for the entirety of their adult life, science could catch up with them. And it put the technique firmly into the mainstream, prompting more agencies to adopt it and more labs to develop the expertise needed to carry it out effectively. Both of these cases share something important with the situation. Investigators are now facing in the Nancy Guthrie case. In all 3 instances, a DNA sample was collected, it was run through CODIS, and it did not match. In both the Moran and Golden State Killer investigations, that apparent dead end turned out not to be the end at all. It was simply the moment where one approach stopped working and another, more patient and more intricate approach had to take over. The Pima County Sheriff has confirmed that the unidentified DNA sample found inside Nancy Guthrie's home is now being processed using genetic genealogy. Companies working in this space, including some that have built strong reputations for solving cases that had gone cold for years, are capable of extraordinary things with the technology that is now available. The process involves identifying shared ancestry markers between the unknown sample and profiles in public genealogy databases, then constructing family trees from those connections and working methodically toward an identification. It is not instantaneous, but it has a track record that is difficult to argue with. There is also a broader point worth making about what the presence of that DNA inside Nancy's home actually means. The sample does not belong to Nancy, to her family, or to anyone known to investigators as a regular visitor to the property. Nancy did have people who came to the house regularly, including hired help such as pool maintenance workers, and those individuals have reportedly already provided DNA samples to investigators. The fact that the unknown sample still cannot be attributed to anyone in that circle suggests it belongs to someone who was not supposed to be there. Someone whose presence in that home would not have a routine or innocent explanation. That is a significant detail, and it is one reason why investigators and analysts following the case closely are treating this particular piece of evidence with a great deal of weight. If genetic genealogy can do what it has done, in other cases it has the potential to put a name to whoever was inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Whether that identification comes in days or weeks, and what it ultimately means for the broader effort to find Nancy herself, remains one of the central questions hanging over this investigation. As the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance moves past the 2-week mark, those following the case closely are experiencing something that is difficult to put into words but easy to recognize. There are moments where it genuinely feels like investigators are closing in, like the pieces are coming together, and some kind of resolution is just around the corner. And then there are other moments where a new detail surfaces and the whole picture feels murkier than it did before, where you are reminded just how much ground law enforcement still has to cover and how many questions remain unanswered. That tension is felt by investigators, by the Guthrie family, and by the many people who have been following this case from the beginning. It is also something that professionals with experience in missing person investigations know very well. At day 18 of the search for Nancy Guthrie, the investigation is at a stage where the pace of visible developments can slow even as the work behind the scenes intensifies. That slowdown can be misleading. It does not necessarily mean that progress has stalled. It often means that investigators are digging into something specific and are not yet ready or not yet able to share what they have found. One of the things worth reflecting on at this point in the investigation is just how many resources have been directed at finding Nancy Guthrie and identifying the people responsible for her disappearance. Reports indicate that somewhere in the region of 400 personnel, including FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, and other investigators, are actively working the case. That is an enormous commitment of manpower for a single investigation. On top of that, major technology companies including Apple and Meta have reportedly reached out to offer assistance. Law enforcement has been in contact with authorities in Mexico. High-tech equipment is being deployed in the search. And the combined reward money on offer for information leading to a breakthrough has now reached $200,000, with $100,000 coming from the FBI and another $100,000 from Crime Stoppers, partly funded by a personal injury attorney based in Wisconsin. When you look at the scale of that effort and then consider that investigators have not yet made an arrest, it is tempting to read that as a sign that the case is faltering. But that interpretation may be too simple. These kinds of investigations are almost never straightforward, and the absence of a public arrest does not mean the absence of progress. Law enforcement agencies, particularly the FBI, are known for keeping their most significant findings extremely close to their chest. They take information from all available sources, including tips, witness statements, and forensic evidence, but they share very little in return, even with local law enforcement partners. What the public sees and hears in press briefings and media interviews is almost certainly a fraction of what investigators actually know at any given point. There is a detail in this case that has attracted attention among people following the investigation closely, and which raises questions that have not yet been fully answered. When reporters were eventually allowed access to the exterior of Nancy Guthrie's property after it was returned to the family, a business card was spotted tucked into the frame of the front door. The card belonged to Arizona Adult Protective Services, which is a division of the Arizona Department of Economic Security. The purpose of that agency is to investigate reports of elder abuse, financial exploitation, neglect, and similar concerns involving vulnerable adults. The presence of that card raises an obvious question. Why was an Adult Protective Services investigator at Nancy Guthrie's home, and when exactly did they visit? The Pima County Sheriff addressed the matter when it was raised in an interview, suggesting that the card was left by an APS worker who came out to the property after a neighbor reported Nancy missing, and that this visit took place on the same Sunday that Nancy disappeared. The sheriff indicated that this was a routine response to a concerned neighbor making a report. But that explanation has not satisfied everyone, and there are reasons to look at it more carefully. If law enforcement had already responded to the scene on that Sunday, and if the sheriff himself had personally attended, which he acknowledged was unusual and which reflected the serious nature of what had been found at the property, then the scene would have been treated as a crime scene from very early on. That raises the question of why an adult protective services worker would have been permitted to approach the front door of an active crime scene, physically handle the door frame, and leave a card in a location that was potentially relevant to the investigation. The area around the front door is significant because it is where the Ring doorbell camera had been installed, and that camera is one of the sources of evidence investigators have been working with. There is also the matter of what prompted someone to contact Adult Protective Services in the first place. The agency does not send investigators out to properties simply because someone has been reported missing. That kind of report would normally go to law enforcement directly. Adult Protective Services gets involved when there is a specific concern about the welfare of a vulnerable adult, such as suspected financial exploitation, abuse by a caregiver, or neglect. If someone contacted APS about Nancy Guthrie, it suggests they had a particular concern about her situation that went beyond simply not knowing where she was. It is possible that the card was left before Nancy disappeared, not after. If that's the case, then it would suggest that someone had already raised a concern about Nancy's well-being or circumstances in the days or weeks prior to her disappearance. Whether that concern is connected to what ultimately happened to her is something investigators would want to know. It is also possible, and this is a point worth noting, that the DNA found inside the house and which does not belong to Nancy or anyone known to her could have been left by an APS worker who visited the property at some point. That would not necessarily imply any wrongdoing on the part of that worker, but it would be relevant information for investigators trying to account for every piece of biological evidence collected from the scene. Requests for comment directed to the Arizona Department of Economic Security regarding the APS card and the timing of any visit to the property have reportedly gone unanswered. That silence does not confirm or deny anything, but it does mean that a potentially important question remains open. Another area where the investigation has drawn public interest is the use of technology to try and locate Nancy Guthrie directly. It's known that Nancy has a pacemaker, and there has been discussion about whether that device could be used to help find her. Law enforcement has reportedly been using what is known as a signal sniffer, a piece of equipment that can detect radio frequency signals, including those emitted by medical devices like pacemakers. The idea is that if Nancy is being held somewhere within a searchable area, the signal from her pacemaker could potentially be detected and used to narrow down her location. The technology is real and it has legitimate applications in search and rescue operations. It has been used successfully in situations such as building collapses, avalanches, and searches in forested areas, where the number of potential signals in the environment is relatively low, and searchers can clear the area of other devices that might interfere. In those kinds of contained environments, the equipment can be genuinely useful for locating a person who has a device emitting a radio frequency signal. However, there are meaningful limitations to what this technology can do in a situation like the one facing investigators in Tucson. Pacemakers are designed to have long battery lives, typically lasting somewhere between 5 and 7 years. To achieve that kind of longevity, the device transmits data at a very low power level and does so infrequently, often only every few minutes. That means the signal is weak and intermittent, which makes it significantly harder to detect from a moving aircraft or drone sweeping across a wide area. The device was not built to be tracked across a city. It was built to communicate with medical equipment in a controlled clinical setting. Using a signal sniffer to try and locate a pacemaker across the urban and suburban sprawl of a city like Tucson is a fundamentally different challenge from using the same equipment to find a person buried in an avalanche. The density of other radio frequency signals in an urban environment, coming from mobile phones, vehicles, household electronics, and countless other sources, creates a level of interference that makes the task considerably more difficult. That does not mean the effort is wasted. With a resource available and a life potentially on the line, it makes sense to use every tool at your disposal, even if the probability of success with any individual tool is not especially high. But it is important to have a realistic understanding of what the technology can and cannot do, rather than treating it as a reliable way of scanning a large area and pinpointing a specific individual. What remains after accounting for all of these threads is a case that is genuinely difficult and that continues to resist easy resolution. 50,000 tips have been received and are being worked through. A SWAT raid was carried out and a person of interest was detained, questioned, and released without being charged. Gun stores are being visited with lists of names and photographs. An APS business card raises questions that have not been fully answered. A signal sniffing device is being used to try and detect a pacemaker signal across a wide search area. And a piece of DNA found inside the home of an 84-year-old woman is being processed through genetic genealogy in the hope that it will eventually lead investigators to a name. None of those threads have produced a definitive public outcome yet. But the people closest to this kind of investigative work are not without hope. Cases that have appeared to stall at the 2 or 3 week mark have broken open before, often because of a single piece of evidence being processed or a single witness coming forward with information they had been sitting on. The reward, money now on the table, gives people with information a financial incentive to come forward, and $200,000 is a significant sum. If anyone has information about the whereabouts of Nancy Guthrie or about the circumstances of her disappearance, the Pima County Sheriff's Office can be reached on 52035-14900. Tips can also be submitted to the FBI by calling 1-800-800-CALL-FBI or by visiting tips.fbi.gov. Every piece of information matters, And with a case this complex, the detail that breaks it open could come from anywhere.